Kyrie to Chronicles of Ancient Greece, the podcast that delves deep into the fascinating history, myths, and legacies of the ancient Greek world. This is episode 12, Owl City. Ask any Athenian in the 5th century BC where the city came from, and you wouldn't hear about Bronze Age settlements or shifting population centers. Nope, the story was much more divine. According to the version widely accepted and proudly painted on pottery, the founding of Athens began with a competition, not between kings, but between gods. At the heart of the myth lies a contest between Poseidon, the very moody god of the sea, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy. Also very moody. So, yeah, the loser was going to take things personally. The gods gathered atop the Acropolis, probably with a bucket of ambrosia popcorn each, and the competitors presented a gift to the fledgling city. Poseidon, with his flair for the dramatic, struck the ground with his trident. Up surged a fountain, clear, cold, and utterly useless because it was salt water. Good job, Poseidon. Athena, by contrast, planted a humble olive tree. It wasn't as flashy, but it was practical. Olives could be eaten, pressed into oil, and exported for profit. Even the leaves had symbolic meaning, associated with peace and victory alike. The audience chose Athena. Very unsurprisingly, because who does not prefer olives to salt water? And so the city took her name. The olive tree became its emblem, and Athena its patron. The Acropolis, where the contest supposedly took place, would later be crowned with the Parthenon, her temple, her sanctuary, her throne above the city. And Poseidon? Well, you guessed it, he took it personally, of course. Depending on what author you choose to believe, he started raging like, well, Poseidon, sending storms, floods, and even earthquakes. He also remained a constant foe to Athens in later time. So remember, kids, Poseidon takes things personally. While modern scholars don't exactly take the myth at face value, it remains an elegant encapsulation of Athens' self-image. Athena's gift represented more than agriculture. It symbolized the values the Athenians liked to claim for themselves: wisdom, prudence, practicality, and peaceful prosperity. Poseidon's failure, meanwhile, reinforced a theme the Athenians would return to often. Strength alone is not enough. Unless you're from Sparta. Once we set the gods aside, though, always a delicate task in ancient history, especially with Athena and Poseidon, we turn to the actual archaeological and historical roots of Athens. Unsurprisingly, they're way less glamorous than divine contests and sacred trees, but still no less fascinating. The earliest settlements on the Acropolis date back to the Neolithic period, around 3000 BC. These first Athenians were farmers, potters, and goat herders living in scattered huts, cultivating barley and lentils, and carving out a modest existence in the Attic plain. If you want a more detailed discussion of Neolithic life in Greece in general, you should go back and listen to episode 1 of this podcast. By the late Bronze Age, Athens had become part of the Mycenaean world. A Mycenaean fortress occupied the Acropolis around 1400 to 1200 BC, complete with a megaron, fortification walls, and storage facilities. Athens, even then, was perched on a hill and looking outward. But around 1100 BC, the Mycenaean world collapsed, as we all know, and are still mystified by. Sea peoples, anyone? Yet, unlike other Mycenaean centers, Mycenae, Pylos, Tyrants, Athens was never fully deserted. It endured, albeit in a reduced and more modest form. That continuity would become a point of pride for Athenians later on, because while other cities vanished, Athens remained. By the 8th century BC, however, the Athens we know and love today emerges. The agora, the civic and economic hub, began to take shape in the flatlands north of the Acropolis. The earliest temples appear, made of wood and thatch at first, then gradually replaced with limestone and marble. Pottery styles shifted towards geometric designs, burial customs evolved, and writing returned, first through contact with the Phoenicians, from whom the Greeks borrowed and adapted the alphabet. Importantly, this period saw Athens transform from a loose collection of villages into a unified urban entity. Historians call this process, if I'm even pronouncing that correctly, synoikismos, or dwelling together. The various Attic tribes and settlements were gradually drawn under a single political structure, with the Acropolis as the religious center and the Agora as the commercial and political one. And by the way, when we talk about Athens, we're really talking about several overlapping landscapes that only gradually fused into something like a coherent urban organism. The iconic marble skyline, the Acropolis rising above terracotta roofs, is just the most visible piece. Beneath that image lies a layered city whose sacred core, civic marketplace, fortified harbors, and far-flung rural communities all had to be knit together administratively if democracy was going to work. Getting that integration right was one of the great practical achievements of the Athenians, and one reason their experiment in math-politics held together as long as it did. And speaking of the Acropolis, by the classical period, it functioned primarily as a sacred precinct and monumental stage set for Athenian identity. After the Persian sack around 480 BC, the Athenians rebuilt on a dazzling scale. The Parthenon, the Erechtheion, the Propylaea, and colossal bronze works like the Athena Promachos proclaimed both piety and political swagger. Archaeological mapping projects that integrate long-running excavations with rescue digs across modern Athens continue to refine the topographical relationship between the Acropolis plateau and the surrounding city fabric enclosed by the Themistoclean wall. As we drop down from the rock into the low ground northwest of the Acropolis, we reach the Agora, the nerve center of classical Athens. This was a place where grain changed hands, lawsuits unfolded before massive juries, magistrates posted decrees, philosophers buttonholed passersby, and politicians tried to persuade or shame their fellow citizens. Continuous excavation by the American School of Classical Studies since 1931 has exposed administrative buildings, stoas for public gathering, shrines, law courts, and drainage systems that speak to heavy multi-purpose use over some 5,000 years of occupation layers. Ongoing publications keep revising details, stratigraphy, building phases, traffic flow, but the big takeaway is stable. The Agora physically embodied the mixing bowl quality of Athenian public life where economic, political, religious, and social functions collided daily. Round about 6 kilometers southwest of the urban core sprawled Piraeus, a rocky peninsula reshaped in the early 5th century BC into a planned harbor city after Themistocles pushed to abandon the shallower Phaleron roadstead. 3 deep defensible basins, Kantharos, which was mainly commercial, Zea, and Munichia, which was primarily naval, gave Athens secure anchorages for merchant shipping and trireme fleets alike. Fortified moles, ship sheds, and grid-planned streets, which were often attributed to Hippodamos, though details remain debated, tied the port to state logistics. Continued archaeological work, both systematic and so-called rescue digs, triggered by modern infrastructure projects, keep yielding wharf structures, naval installations, and domestic remains that refine our picture of how closely integrated the harbor economy was with the city's grain supply, tribute flows, and imperial administration. Because our mental picture of Athens tends to zoom in on temples and stoas, it's very easy to forget that most Athenians spent most of their time in modest mud brick or rubble-built houses organized around interior courtyards. Recent synthetic work on Greek domestic architecture emphasizes variability across class and religion and warns against over-rigid male front room, female back room models traditionally drawn from texts. Excavated houses near the agora show single-entrance courtyard layouts adapted to tight urban lots. The archaeological record, roof tiles, drainage, cooking installations, confirms dense occupation beneath later building phases across the Themistoclean and Valerian wall footprints now being digitally mapped in large georeferenced datasets. The earliest political memory Athens preserved was that of kings, basileis, but, like everything Mycenaean, the transition into history is messy. By the time we have anything resembling a historical record, which is around the 8th to 7th centuries BC, Athens is already ruled not by kings, but by archons, yearly magistrates selected from the aristocratic elite. Later tradition retroactively constructed a list of mythical and semi-mythical kings, for example, Cecrops, Erechtheus, Cadros, but modern historians recognize this as more poetic genealogy than reliable record. What we can say with some confidence, however, is that unlike many other Greek polis, Athens did not fall under the spell of a dominant tyrant during this early period. The absence of tyranny allowed the elite families, the Eupatridae, to maintain a tight grip on the levers of power. But it also meant that they had to sort out governance amongst themselves without a strongman referee. Which brings us to Solon, a statesman we might call the first self-conscious political reformer in Western history. Though, if you'd ask him, he saw himself more as a poet-philosopher forcibly recruited into problem-solving. In the early 6th century BC, Athens was a city on the verge of social breakdown. Small farmers were falling into debt slavery, aristocratic infighting was rampant, and there was no common legal framework for citizens to appeal to. Solon's reforms, preserved in fragments and later summaries, attempted to stabilize the situation without upending the social hierarchy entirely. His famous shaking off of burdens, cancelled debts, and freed enslaved citizens, but it did not redistribute land. He created 4 wealth-based property classes, each with corresponding political rights. The highest offices were reserved for the wealthiest, but even the lowest class, the thetes, could participate in the ecclesia, which was the assembly, and serve on juries in the newly empowered helaia, the so-called people's court. Solon also insisted that citizens should seek legal redress through codified law, not personal vengeance. He then left Athens for 10 years, reportedly to avoid having to manage the consequences of his own reforms. Which is really pretty funny if you think about it. He was basically saying, hey, here are some of the most far-reaching and consequential reforms of all time. Have fun with it. I'm going on holiday. Modern historians, though, debate how much of Solon's constitution was actually implemented or effective. Consensus holds that his efforts to dilute aristocratic monopolies, legally empower poorer citizens, and link civic rights to economic contribution, not birth alone, helped set the conditions for later democratic developments. Now, to be clear, Solon didn't create democracy, but he did create a legal and ideological frame in which democracy could be imagined. After Solon's reforms failed to produce lasting equilibrium, though, Athens fell into a pattern common across the Greek world: tyranny. Around 561 BC, Pisistratus seized power with a mix of personal charisma, populist policies, and creative showmanship, including an infamous stunt involving a tall woman dressed as Athena to escort him into the city. Sounds fun. Pisistratus was exiled twice, but returned stronger each time, ultimately ruling as a benevolent autocrat until his death in 528 BC. His sons Hippias and Hipparchus succeeded him, but their regime soured, particularly after Hipparchus was assassinated in 514 BC by Harmodius and Aristogaton, the so-called tyrannicides. Hippias grew paranoid and repressive, prompting his eventual expulsion in 510 BC by Spartan intervention. With Hippias gone, a power vacuum emerged. Cleisthenes, a member of the powerful Alcmenoid family, saw an opportunity not just to seize office, but to reinvent the polis. His reforms, enacted around 508-507 BC, were administrative genius disguised as democratic liberation. Most radically, Cleisthenes made the deme the foundation of civic identity. From now on, a citizen's political standing came not from clan or class, but from where they lived, and everyone, well, all male citizens anyway, was accounted for. Cleisthenes also introduced ostracism, a novel mechanism by which the assembly could vote to exile any citizen for 10 years, no trial required. It was basically a democratic safety valve designed to preempt new tyrannies by removing would-be strongmen before they gained momentum. The reforms worked. Within a generation, Athenians weren't just accepting mass participation in governance, they were fiercely attached to it. Archaeological evidence and inscriptions confirm the increasing formalization of demi-records, quota systems, and rotational offices around the 5th century BC. Cleisthenes didn't invent democracy out of nothing, but he gave it the administrative scaffolding it needed to function at scale. What actually made Athenian democracy tick wasn't ideological purity. It was paperwork, rotating office, and a love of randomization. Because by the mid-5th century BC, nearly every major civic institution in Athens had embraced sortition, selection by lot, as the gold standard for public service. The logic's pretty simple, actually. If offices were allocated by chance, with some eligibility filters, of course, no one faction could dominate. Just imagine today having to serve at the DMV because you drew the short straw. By God, am I happy that times have changed. The Bull of 500 prepared legislation and oversaw bureaucratic functions. The Ecclesia Assembly voted on laws and war. Massive jury panels of 201 to 501 or even more citizens judged trials and could overrule magistrates. There were archons, strategoi, which are basically generals, treasurers, market inspectors, and religious officials, each rotating annually or biannually to prevent entrenchment. Just compare that with senators that serve for 20 or more years. Historians now emphasize how much logistics this system required. Public pay for jurors, record-keeping for lot-added eligible citizens, and daily management by a rotating prytany, which is an executive committee of 50 counselors. This was not amateur hour. It was carefully scaffolded grassroots governance. Some scholars argue that this infrastructure produced a knowledge economy of participation, where the act of ruling was widely distributed and self-reinforcing. Others warn against romanticizing it. The system excluded women, slaves, and metics, which are resident foreigners, and it could swing unpredictably in times of stress. And Athenian democracy's openness also made it vulnerable. During the Peloponnesian War, the Athenian state briefly collapsed into oligarchy, first in the revolution of 411 BC, the so-called 400, and again after defeat in 404 BC, when the Spartan-backed 30 tyrants ruled with blood and fear. In both cases, democracy restored itself eventually. Violently, sure, but decisively. But it didn't mean that it was safe all the time. To be an Athenian meant not just being born in the right place. It meant being born to the right kind of parents, with the right kind of anatomy, and usually with a decent amount of leisure time. For all its radicalism and governance, Athenian society was a deeply stratified, patriarchal, and exclusionary system that granted full civic agency to a narrow slice of the population, namely, of course, adult male citizens. Full citizens, so-called politai, had the right to vote in the assembly, serve on juries, hold office, and own land. They also bore responsibilities, of course. Military service, participation in civic festivals, and financial contributions to state liturgies if wealthy enough. For the average male citizen, especially of the lower classes, civic life could be an absolutely time-consuming affair. Attend the assembly, serve on a jury, inspect the grain market, drill with the militia, and still find time to tend to your olive trees? Well, no wonder Pericles introduced jury pay. The flip side, however, most people in Athens were not citizens. Slaves, women, metics, and resident children made up the majority of the population, yet they had no say in the state. And if the Athenian citizen body was exclusive, Athenian gender roles were positively barbed wired. Women, even citizen women, were formally excluded from all political participation. They could not vote, hold office, serve on juries, or speak in the assembly even. Their legal status was akin to permanent minors, always under the guardianship of a male relative, a kyrios, be it father, husband, or son even. That did not mean women were unimportant in Athenian life. Far from it. They ran households, managed slaves, and played crucial roles in religion. Indeed, some of the most prestigious roles in Athenian cult were reserved for women. The priestess of Athena Polias, the Arephoroi, who are young girls who served in sacred rituals, or the Canaphoroi, who are basket carriers in processions. Religious festivals like the Thesmophoria, conducted by and for women, shaped Athenian spirituality in ways often invisible to our male-dominated literary record. Archaeological finds, especially grave goods and domestic artifacts, help paint a more nuanced picture than the Athenian orators would have us believe. Recent scholarship has stressed that Athenian women were not locked away like Victorian housewives. They were visible in public life, at markets, temples, wells, and funerals. But their roles were shaped by ideology and law that marked them as fundamentally others, not legal actors but vital domestic partners. As one scholar puts it, Athenian women were central but silent, or at least silenced. And speaking of central but silent, we will not be talking about all of the wars Athens was embroiled in, like the Persian and Peloponnesian wars. They deserve their own moment on this stage. They will get it. Just not now. Suffice it to say for today, though, after Marathon and the Persian invasions, Athens, led by bold figures like Themistocles, built a fleet of triremes that not only defended Greece, but also became the engine of influence. Out of that military reality grew the Delian League, ostensibly a voluntary alliance to keep Persia at bay, founded around 478-477 BC. But alliances obviously take habits, and habits harden into power structures, especially if you're the most important polis. In this case, Athens was. What distinguishes the Athenian Empire was its mixture of democracy at home and dominion abroad. And by the term Athenian Empire, you can already guess what happened to the Delian League. Athens collected tributes from its allies, kept the money in a common treasury on Delos, and then, in a decisive act of centralization around 455 BC, moved the funds to the Acropolis. As you guessed it, that move changed everything. The league's money became Athens' money. The triremes that had been for mutual defense now enforced Athenian policy, and the so-called allies found themselves paying for Athens' building program, its festivals, and its navy. I imagine that must have been a hell of an, excuse me, moment for the other members of the Delian League. Under Pericles, in the mid-5th century BC, Athens reached its zenith. The Parthenon rose, drama flourished on the Dionysia, and the empire funded a cultural renaissance that still shapes us today. Sculpture, history, public oratory, even the idea of civic magnificence. Pericles' leadership fused popular politics with imperial ambition. The people ruled and the people enjoyed the spoils. So, Pericles is kind of a big deal. But empire has consequences. The satellites of Athens started to chafe. Corinthian and Spartan interests pushed back. Athenian attempts to pry into others' affairs bred resentment. The very democracy that made Athens radiant at home made it heavy-handed abroad. Courts and diarchies, which are Athenian-appointed governments, replaced local autonomy, and tribute lists read like a ledger of dependency. These are the tensions that will eventually explode into the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides, who watched the decline and tried to explain it, treats the Athenian Empire not as an accident, but as a structural destiny. Naval power plus wealth plus democratic zeal confronting rival land power in Sparta. Defeat in 404 BC ended Athens' imperial rule, at least politically, but it didn't end its cultural authority. Oh, yeah, spoiler alert, obviously. We'll get to the Peloponnesian War in very, very great detail. So, what do we take away from today's discussion of Athens? Well, like Sparta, Athens was no utopia. Its democracy excluded women, foreigners, and slaves. Its empire was often brutal. Athens executed Socrates and exiled generals. It stumbled into wars it couldn't win. And yet, perhaps its greatest legacy is this: it knew it was flawed, and it talked about it. Athens created a culture of self-critique. In its agora, its plays, its philosophies, and even its funerals, Athenians debated the good, the just, the true. Athens didn't always live up to its ideals, but it had them. And that makes a difference. Modern democracies still wrestle with the same questions Athens did. Who counts as a citizen? Is it democratic to exclude people from the rights? What do we owe the state? And what does the state owe us? Can freedom survive fear? How do we keep the filthy rich from buying influence? If power corrupts, how do we guard against ourselves? In the end, Athens is not an otherworldly polis, but a flawed city. It did, however, take much longer to discuss than Sparta, and we could have talked even longer about basically everything. Theater, philosophy, and the likes deserve their own episodes, but there is definitely poetry in having a very short and to-the-point summary of the Spartans, who were nothing if not to the point, versus a long and winding explanation of Athens where things were discussed endlessly. It's almost as if I had planned it like that.